All right, everyone, get ready because today we are going deep into the world of AI benchmarking.
Ooh, that's a good one.
You know, with all the crazy headlines we see about AI doing these amazing things and even some concerning things,
Right.
I really think that this deep dive is going to be an eye-opener.
Yeah, it is. It is.
You sent us this fascinating research paper
Uh-huh.
from the European Commission that really goes into the potential problems with evaluating AI.
Yeah. And it really seems like every other day there's some new AI
Mm-hmm.
that can like write a symphony or predict the stock market or something.
Right, right.
But how do we actually know
Yeah.
what these systems can really do?
Right. And can we trust the tests
Exactly.
that are supposed to be telling us how well these systems are performing?
Yeah, that's the big question.
And that is where these benchmarks come in.
That's right.
Right. They're like the SATs for AI.
Yeah, exactly. As AI becomes more and more integrated into our lives,
Mm-hmm.
everything from healthcare to self-driving cars. It's so important to have a reliable way to assess, how they perform.
Yeah.
And this research paper is basically arguing that we might be putting a little too much faith in these benchmarks without fully understanding their limitations.
And this paper is actually a meta-review
Yes.
of about 100 different studies
Wow.
that critique AI benchmarking.
A lot of people raising some red flags.
That's a lot of experts saying, hey,
Yeah.
we need to be careful here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So to kick things off, let's clarify what AI benchmarks actually are.
Okay.
How would you explain those to someone who's not super familiar with AI?
So imagine you're back in school and you have to take one of those standardized tests.
Right.
That test is designed to measure your knowledge and skills in a specific subject, right?
Ah.
AI benchmarks do the same thing.
Okay.
But for AI models instead of for students.
Gotcha.
They are basically standardized tests that use data sets and performance metrics
Okay.
to evaluate how well an AI can perform a particular task.
So if an AI aced the math portion of the SATs, that would mean that it's really good at, I don't know, like calculating rocket trajectories or something.
Exactly like that.
Okay.
And the reason why these benchmarks are so important is because they help us track the progress of AI development.
Right.
Are these systems actually getting better at what they're supposed to do?
Are they improving?
Mhm.
Are we actually making progress?
Right. And they also help us identify any weaknesses.
Okay.
Like if an AI consistently struggles with certain types of problems on a benchmark, that could indicate a vulnerability
Right.
that needs to be addressed.
It's like showing us where the holes are
Exactly.
so we can fix them.
Yeah, but there's actually another reason why these benchmarks are gaining even more importance these days.
Okay, let me guess. It has something to do with the whole AI regulation debate
You got it.
that's been heating up.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Benchmarks are increasingly being used in regulatory frameworks like the EU's AI Act to actually assess the potential risks of AI.
So if an AI is going to be used in like a high-stakes application,
Yes.
like healthcare or transportation,
Mm-hmm.
regulators want to make sure that it's been thoroughly vetted,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah.
And these benchmarks are seen as like a key part
Exactly.
of that evaluation process.
Yeah, they're becoming a bigger and bigger part of the whole picture.
So it sounds like we need these benchmarks
They do.
to navigate this crazy world of AI that's constantly evolving.
Yeah,
They're like our compass
that's a good way to think about it.
in this uncharted territory. But this research paper is saying that our compass might be faulty.
That's exactly it.
Oh, wow.
That's the core issue.
Okay.
This paper really dives into a whole bunch of problems with these AI benchmarks. And basically, all the experts who've contributed to these 100 studies that we're talking about are saying,
Yeah.
hold on, we need to be a lot more careful about how much trust we're putting in these tests.
Okay. I am officially intrigued. Lay it on me. What is the first major problem area?
Okay, well, one of the biggest concerns is the data itself.
Oh.
There are often problems with how these data sets are collected,
Mhm.
annotated, and documented.
Right.
Sometimes it's not even clear where the data came from, who labeled it, or what biases might be present in the data.
So it's like trying to judge a chef's skills based on a mystery basket of ingredients.
Yeah,
You know,
that's a good way to put it.
you might get a delicious meal, but you have no idea how they did it,
Right,
or if they had access to better ingredients than other chefs.
exactly. Without that information,
Yeah.
it's impossible to really understand the limitations of the data and how that might be skewing the results of the benchmark.
And AI models learn from the data that they're trained on.
Yes.
So if the data is flawed, the AI is probably going to inherit those flaws as well.
Exactly. It's like garbage in, garbage out.
Right. But with AI,
Yeah,
it could have much higher stakes. We're talking about potentially AI making decisions that impact people's lives.
absolutely. And it's not just about missing information.
Okay.
There's also this whole issue of spurious correlations.
Spurious correlations.
Yes, in the data.
Okay.
And this is where an AI model might exploit quirks in the data to get a good score on a benchmark without really understanding the task it's supposed to be doing.
Okay, break that down for me. What do you mean by like exploiting quirks?
Okay, so imagine an AI that's supposed to detect cancer cells in a medical image.
Uh-huh.
And it does amazingly well on the benchmark.
Okay.
But it turns out it's not actually detecting the cancer cells.
What?
It's learned to identify a specific type of scanner
Okay.
that was used to take the images of the patients who actually had cancer.
So the AI is basically cheating.
Kind of.
It's finding a shortcut
Yeah.
to get that high score
Mhm.
without actually learning how to identify cancer cells.
Exactly. It was fooled by a spurious correlation in the data.
Uh-huh.
It focused on a feature that happened to be correlated with cancer in the training data.
Right.
But that correlation doesn't hold true in the real world.
Oh, wow.
And this is a huge problem because if we're not careful,
Yeah.
those spurious correlations can lead us to believe that an AI is much more capable
Right.
than it actually is.
So it's like a false positive.
Yes, exactly. It gives us a misleading picture of what the AI can actually do.
This reminds me of that study a while back where an AI was supposedly able to predict future criminals
Oh, yeah.
based on their facial features.
Yeah.
But it turned out that it was really just picking up on racial biases in the data that it was trained on.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of how these spurious correlations can reflect and even amplify existing societal biases.
Yeah, and it makes it really clear that we have to look at these AI systems very carefully,
Hmm.
even when they seem to be performing well on benchmarks.
Right.
You know, we need to ask, is the AI actually learning what we want it to learn? Or is it just finding shortcuts?
That's the key question.
So the takeaway here is that the data that's used in AI benchmarks needs to be treated with a lot more care
Yes,
and transparency.
100%.
We need to know where it came from,
Yeah.
how it was collected and labeled, and what biases might be lurking in the data.
Absolutely.
And we can't just assume that a high score on a benchmark means that an AI is truly capable.
Right.
We need to understand how it's arriving at its answers.
Exactly. We need to look under the hood.
You got to see what's going on in there.
Yeah, and this brings us to another major issue highlighted in the research paper,
Okay.
construct validity.
Construct validity.
Yeah, it sounds a little intimidating,
It
but
does sound a little intimidating.
I promise it's a pretty simple concept.
Okay.
It basically asks, does this benchmark actually measure what it's claiming to measure?
Okay, that makes sense. But why is that such a big problem in AI?
Well, if a benchmark isn't measuring what it's supposed to be measuring, then the results are meaningless.
Right.
And this happens more often than you might think.
Really?
Yeah. For example, there are many benchmarks that claim to measure things like fairness or bias.
Okay, those are pretty important things to measure, especially as AI is being used in more and more sensitive applications.
Right, like loan applications.
Yeah, or criminal justice.
Exactly. High stakes decisions.
But how can a benchmark fail to accurately measure something like fairness?
Well, fairness is a complex concept.
It does.
And there isn't always a clear consensus on exactly how to define or measure it. So a benchmark might use a definition of fairness that's too narrow or too broad,
Okay.
or that doesn't align with the values of the people who will be affected by the AI system.
So it's like trying to measure the temperature of a room using a thermometer that's calibrated to the wrong scale.
Oh, I like that.
You're going to get a reading, but it's not going to tell you the actual temperature of the room.
That's a great analogy.
Right.
And it really highlights the need to be critical of the metrics that are being used
Yeah.
in these AI benchmarks.
Yeah.
We need to ask ourselves, what is this benchmark actually measuring, and is that a meaningful measure of the concept we're interested in?
Yeah, it sounds like we can't just blindly trust the numbers. We really need to understand the context,
Right.
the definitions,
Yes,
the limitations of these benchmarks.
absolutely. You've got to understand what you're looking at.
Yeah, and this leads us to another issue.
Okay.
Benchmarks often rely on data that doesn't truly reflect the complexity of the real world.
That's a big one.
Okay, give me an example of that.
Okay, so imagine a benchmark that's designed to evaluate the safety of a self-driving car.
All right.
It might use simulations or closed-course tests
Right.
to assess the car's ability to navigate different
That
scenarios.
sounds pretty reasonable to me.
Yeah, it sounds good on paper,
Yeah.
but the real world
Mm-hmm.
is a lot messier and a lot less predictable than a simulation.
Right. Like there are other drivers
Yeah.
and pedestrians and weather.
Exactly. You've got unpredictable weather conditions. You have aggressive drivers.
Bottles.
Yeah, potholes, pedestrians who jaywalk.
Kids and animals.
Yeah, all kinds of things.
Running out into the street.
Exactly. And a simulation just can't capture all of that.
So even if a self-driving car aced all the tests in a simulated environment, it might still struggle when it's faced with the chaos of real-world driving.
Precisely. And that's why it's so important to make sure that these AI benchmarks are grounded in real-world data and real-world scenarios. Otherwise, we risk developing AI systems that are brittle, inflexible, and potentially dangerous when they're actually deployed outside of that controlled environment of the lab.
So this whole construct validity thing seems to be a recurring theme in AI benchmarking.
It is a big one.
It's like we're trying to measure the universe with a ruler that's only a few inches long.
I like that.
It doesn't quite work.
That it doesn't cut it.
And it highlights the need for us to find more rigorous and nuanced approaches to AI evaluation.
Yes, absolutely.
We need to move beyond these simplistic benchmarks and develop methods that can truly capture the complexity of these systems and how they impact the world.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here in this first part of our deep dive.
We have.
You know, from the importance of that data transparency to the challenges of measuring complex concepts like fairness, and even the need for these benchmarks to reflect the complexity of the real world.
Absolutely.
Before we move on to the next part, are there any other critical limitations of AI benchmarking that we should be aware of?
Oh, there are definitely a few more.
Okay.
And that's exactly what we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive. So, we were just talking about how these benchmarks often struggle to keep up with the real world.
Right.
And that actually ties into another big challenge,
Yep.
the influence of commercial and competitive pressures.
So now we're getting into the economics of AI.
Yeah.
I have a feeling this is where things could get a little messy.
It can get a little tricky, yeah.
Yeah.
Companies are pouring tons of money into AI research and development,
Right.
and they want to show that their investments are paying off. Yeah.
So there's a huge incentive for them to make sure that their AIs score really well
Exactly.
on these benchmarks, even if it means cutting corners.
Yeah, benchmarks can become less about rigorous evaluation and more about just marketing.
Yeah.
Companies might be tempted to game the system to get those really impressive scores, even if it doesn't reflect the true capabilities of their AI.
So is that even possible? Like, how can you game an AI benchmark?
Well, there are a few ways it can happen.
Yeah.
One is data contamination.
Data contamination.
Yeah, where an AI might have already seen the benchmark data during its training.
So it's like giving a student the test answers beforehand.
Exactly.
They aced the exam, but they didn't actually learn the material.
Exactly. It's like cheating.
Right.
Yeah, and that completely undermines the whole purpose of the benchmark.
Are there other, more subtle ways to manipulate these results?
There's something called sandbagging.
Sandbagging.
Yeah, where developers can intentionally make their AI underperform on benchmarks.
Wait, really? Why would they do that?
It sounds counterintuitive.
It does.
But it can be a way to avoid scrutiny from regulators or to avoid certain regulations altogether.
So a company could have a super powerful AI.
Right.
But they intentionally dumb it down.
Yes.
So that it doesn't raise any red flags.
Exactly. It's like a poker player pretending to have a weak hand.
Wow, that's sneaky.
It is a little sneaky.
Yeah, so it really makes you wonder how much we can trust the results that we're seeing.
Yeah. If companies are manipulating those scores, it really undermines the whole purpose of benchmarking. It definitely raises concerns about transparency and accountability.
Yeah.
And, this problem is kind of made worse by the fact that you have these big tech companies that are so dominant in AI research.
Right.
They have the resources to create and influence benchmarks, which could accidentally steer the field towards their specific approaches.
So it's not just about individual companies trying to cheat.
Right.
It's about the potential for the whole field to be kind of biased.
Yeah, exactly. It's a systemic issue.
It was the interest of the biggest players.
Yes, and that underscores the need for more diversity.
Yeah.
And independence in how these AI benchmarks are developed.
Okay.
And governed. We need to make sure that these tests are truly representative of the broader AI landscape. and not just the interests of a select few.
It's all starting to feel a bit like an arms race.
Yeah.
Not just in developing powerful AI, but in figuring out how to accurately measure it and even control it.
It's a constant back and forth.
Yeah.
And that brings us to another issue.
Okay.
The limitations of the peer review process.
In AI benchmarking.
Yes. Peer review is supposed to be that gold standard
Right.
for quality and rigor in scientific research.
Yeah.
But it's not perfect.
So how does that play out with these AI benchmarks?
Well, in theory, peer review should catch a lot of these problems.
No.
But in practice, there are some issues.
Yeah.
One is path dependency.
Path dependence.
Where, popular benchmarks become really entrenched, even if they have flaws.
Yeah.
Simply because they've been used for a long time and they're cited a lot.
Right. It's like sticking with an old, outdated textbook.
Yeah.
Just because it's familiar.
Exactly.
Even though there are newer, more accurate ones available.
Yes. It can stifle innovation in evaluation methods.
Yeah.
And prevent the adoption of better, more robust benchmarks.
So we're stuck in a rut. Kind of.
A little bit, yeah.
Relying on benchmarks that might not actually be up to the task anymore.
That's the risk.
Just because they've been around for a while.
Right. And there's another issue.
Okay.
Related to peer review. It's this lack of critical focus on the data sets themselves.
The data sets again?
Yeah. A lot of these benchmark papers, they prioritize the development of new evaluation methods.
Okay.
But they don't really give enough attention to the quality of the data.
So it's like building a fancy new race car.
Yes.
But neglecting to check the quality of the fuel.
Exactly.
You might have a powerful engine, but if you're putting bad fuel in it,
yeah, it's not going to perform well.
it's not going to run properly.
That's right. We need to be just as critical of the data as we are of the methods.
So a flawed data set can undermine even the most sophisticated evaluation method.
100%.
This is painting kind of a sobering picture.
It is.
About AI benchmarking.
It's a challenging landscape.
Yeah, it seems like we're dealing with a system that's kind of biased, prone to manipulation, and struggling to keep up with AI development as AI keeps changing so rapidly.
And it's evolving at an incredible speed.
It really is.
It makes it really difficult to keep up.
It's like we're trying to hit a moving target that's constantly accelerating.
Exactly. And this leads to something called benchmark saturation.
Benchmark saturation.
Where AI models are advancing so rapidly that they're actually outperforming the existing benchmarks.
So the tests are becoming too easy.
That's one way to think about it.
Okay.
Yeah, they're no longer challenging enough to give us a meaningful assessment.
Like a student who's so advanced that they're getting perfect scores on these tests.
Yes.
That are designed for like a much lower grade level.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
Yeah, the benchmarks aren't really pushing the boundaries
right.
of what these systems can do anymore.
And to make matters even worse, it seems like every time we turn around, AI is doing something new.
Right.
Something unexpected. How can these benchmarks possibly keep up with all these surprises?
It's incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
The benchmarks really struggle to anticipate and evaluate these new risks and new capabilities that are emerging from these rapid advancements.
Yeah, it's like trying to predict the weather weeks in advance.
Yeah.
You might get some general trends, but
you never know.
There are always those unexpected storms and shifts that can throw off those predictions.
100%.
So even if we manage to address all the problems that we've talked about so far, the data biases, the construct validity issues, the gaming of the system, the peer review limitations, the benchmark saturation, we're still left with this like huge unknown factor.
That's right. And it's one of the most fundamental challenges in AI. We're dealing with systems that are so complex and rapidly evolving that it's incredibly difficult to predict all the potential harms they might pose.
It's like we're sailing in uncharted waters.
Yeah.
And we don't even know what kind of sea monsters are lurking beneath the surface.
That's a very evocative analogy.
That's right.
And it highlights the need for humility and caution.
Yeah.
As we navigate this new technological frontier.
Yeah, we can't just assume that we've anticipated every risk. There are going to be surprises.
Absolutely.
And we need to be prepared to adapt.
Be flexible.
And learn as we go.
Yes, exactly.
This all sounds incredibly daunting, but I have to believe that there are people working on solutions to these challenges.
There are.
We can't just give up.
No, absolutely not. There are a lot of really brilliant researchers and organizations who are dedicated to developing more robust and reliable ways to evaluate AI, and that's exactly what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive.
So welcome back to the deep dive. Before we went to the break, we were talking about all of these challenges with AI, benchmarking,
Right.
and, kind of seems like a catch-22.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we need these benchmarks
We do.
to understand and regulate AI, but the benchmarks themselves might not be up to the task,
Yeah.
especially with AI evolving so quickly.
It's hard to keep up.
Yeah, it's like we're trying to measure a shape-shifting creature
Yeah.
with a ruler that keeps changing size.
That's a great way to put it.
It just doesn't quite work.
It doesn't, but that doesn't mean we should give up.
Okay, so what are some of the things that people are working on?
Yeah.
To address these challenges, what are the approaches that they're exploring?
Okay, well, one promising area is dynamic benchmarking.
Dynamic benchmarking.
Instead of using static data sets that AI can basically memorize
Right.
or game,
They figure out how to cheat.
yeah, these dynamic benchmarks are constantly evolving,
Okay.
and they use techniques like adversarial training,
Adversarial training.
where AI systems are basically pitted against each other.
Oh, so it's like a never-ending sparring match where
Exactly.
each AI is trying to outsmart the other one.
Yeah, it helps to make sure that the benchmark is always kind of one step ahead, which makes it much harder for the AI to cheat or exploit weaknesses in how it's being evaluated.
It's like an arms race, but between the evaluator
Right.
and the AI.
Yeah, a constant back and forth.
Okay, so constantly updating these benchmarks sounds like a huge undertaking.
It can be.
Yeah.
Which is why another approach is to create multitask benchmarks
Multitask benchmarks.
that can assess a range of capabilities instead of just focusing on one narrow skill.
So instead of just giving it like a 100-meter dash,
Mhm.
it's like giving it a whole decathlon
That's a good way to think about it.
to get like a much more well-rounded picture of its abilities.
Exactly, and it can also be a lot more efficient.
Right.
Because you're testing multiple things at once.
All at the same time.
Yeah, and you get a better sense of the AI's overall competence.
Yeah.
And you reduce the risk of it being really good at one thing.
Right.
But then being deficient in other areas.
Can't just specialize and then
Right. You want to see
the whole
you're
picture.
good at other things.
Yeah, you want a well-rounded AI.
Are there other strategies that are being explored to make these evaluations better?
Yeah, there are definitely other things people are working on.
Oh.
There's this growing movement towards incorporating human judgment
Oh, God.
into the evaluation process.
Bringing humans back into the loop.
Exactly. And this is especially helpful for assessing those more complex capabilities. It's
Yeah.
like things that are harder to quantify with numbers.
Like creativity.
Exactly. Creativity,
Yeah.
empathy,
Yeah.
common sense, things like that.
Like you can't just put a number on those things.
Not really.
Yeah, so it's almost like having judges at like an art competition.
Yeah.
You can measure technical skill,
Mm-hmm.
but you need like a human to judge things like originality or emotional impact.
Exactly. And that's especially important when you're talking about AI systems that are going to be interacting with humans in the real world.
Right.
Purely numerical score just doesn't capture the whole picture.
It sounds like we're realizing that evaluating AI can't just be about
Right.
numbers.
Not entirely.
We need that human element to provide that context.
Yes, it's about combining the strengths of humans and machines
Yeah.
to create those more comprehensive and trustworthy assessments.
And speaking of trustworthiness, there's another important development I want to touch on.
Okay.
And that is the emergence of frameworks for evaluating the benchmarks themselves. Ooh, that's an interesting one.
So we're benchmarking the benchmarks now.
We are. It might sound a little meta,
It does a little bit.
but it's really important because we need to be just as critical of the tools we're using to evaluate AI
Right.
as we are of the AI itself.
So it's like quality control.
Exactly.
For the tests themselves. You're
Right.
making sure that the tests are actually good tests.
Yeah, like having a set of rules for the rule makers.
Exactly. It's like who watches the watchmen.
Right.
But in this case, it's like who benchmarks the benchmarkers.
You got it.
This deep dive has been eye-opening.
It has.
It's clear that AI benchmarking is really complex.
It is.
It's rapidly evolving.
Yeah, it's a constantly moving target.
And there's a lot of work to do to improve it.
But the good news is that people are working on it. There's a growing awareness of how important this is.
Yeah. So for our listener who's been with us on this journey, what's the key takeaway here? What should they remember?
Well, the most important thing is to be informed, to be critical of the information that you're seeing about AI.
Don't believe everything you read.
Don't take those claims about AI capabilities at face value.
Right. Ask questions.
Yes, dig a little deeper.
Don't be afraid to be skeptical.
Exactly. And remember, those benchmark scores are just one piece of the puzzle.
Right. We need to look beyond those headlines.
Absolutely.
Understand what those benchmarks are actually measuring.
Yes.
And what their limitations are.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, this has been a fantastic deep dive.
It has.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
It's been my pleasure.
And to you, our listener, thank you for sending us this source material and for trusting us to guide you through it.
Yes, thank you for listening.
We hope you found this deep dive insightful
and thought-provoking
and empowering. And remember, as AI continues to change our world,
it is.
The most important thing is to stay informed.
Stay engaged.
Stay engaged.
And keep asking questions.
And keep asking those critical questions.
Absolutely.
We'll see you next time.
See you next time.